Celtics owner just confessed he almost blocked the Jaylen Brown trade, and now Boston's eyeing DeMar DeRozan. Celtics fans, sit down for this one because we just got the most honest admission we've heard from ownership in years. Bill Chisholm, the man who signs the checks in Boston, went on the radio this week and basically told the world, "I didn't want to trade Jaylen Brown." He said it took the smartest people in the building to talk him into it. Not the fans, not the media. The front office had to convince the owner himself. And that's not even the only Jaylen Brown story breaking right now. While Boston is still digesting the fallout from that trade, a national NBA writer just dropped a new report claiming the Celtics are now the #1 landing spot for a 6-time All-Star scorer, specifically because of the hole Jaylen Brown left behind. 2 stories, one thread connecting them. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Celtics Daily Hub, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we cover every single angle of this Celtics season. The good, the bad, and today, the genuinely stunning. The owner admits it. I needed to be convinced. Brad Stevens is now fully on the hook for the Jaylen Brown trade. Let's rewind for a second for anyone who needs the recap. Back in early July, the Boston Celtics made the biggest move of their offseason. They sent Jaylen Brown, their leading scorer last season, an all-NBA player, a guy who finished 6th in MVP voting, out of town. In return, Boston got Paul George, 2 first-round picks and 2 second-round picks. At the time, the front office called it a financial necessity. Brown and Jason Tatum were both on supermax money, and team president Brad Stevens pointed directly at the math. Roughly 70% of the salary cap tied up in 2 players, with an enormous share of the team's offensive usage running through both of them. Something had to give under the league's new second apron rules. That was the official story in July. But here's where it gets interesting. In the weeks since, we've learned there were actually 2 competing messages coming out of Boston at the same time. One message said the relationship with Brown could still be repaired, that a reunion wasn't off the table. The other message said Boston could have waited even later into the summer and gotten more value in return. Both of those were, in hindsight, the organization covering itself. Because what's become clear now is that Brad Stevens was not just open to trading Brown, he was pushing hard, and he believed the front office needed to move fast before Brown's value started to slip. Now here's the part that's really blowing up this week. Celtics owner Bill Chisholm sat down on the Greg Hill Show on WEEI in Boston during the 24th annual WEEI and NESN Jimmy Fund Radio Telethon, and he did not hide how conflicted he was. Chisholm said flatly, "I needed to be convinced, that's my job." Think about that phrasing for a second. The man who owns the franchise, who has the actual authority to say no, is telling Boston Sports Radio that his own front office had to talk him into pulling the trigger on trading a homegrown superstar and reigning finals MVP. He didn't stop there either. Chisholm told the station, and we're paraphrasing closely here because his words were pretty raw, it was one of the toughest calls he's dealt with as an owner. He said he trusts Brad Stevens and the front office completely, that he believes Boston has the best basketball operations staff in the league, and that it's been a real competitive advantage for this franchise. But as a fan, and Chisholm was very clear that he considers himself a superfan first, he said he had to consciously strip the fan passion out of his decision-making. His exact words were something like, "You basically have to be a bit of a sociopath if you don't think at all about what the fan base is going to feel." And then the line that's now circulating everywhere, "We've got the best brains in basketball, and this was something they had real conviction around." So let's sit with that for a second because there's a lot buried in those quotes. First, Chisholm is openly telling us he was against this trade, or at minimum deeply skeptical of it, before his front office worked on him. Second, he's confirming that Brad Stevens was the driving force. And third, and this is the part that should make every Celtics fan pay attention, the organization has also confirmed that head coach Joe Mazzulla was not part of the decision to trade Brown. Think about that. The guy who has to walk into the locker room every single day and build chemistry with whoever's left on the roster wasn't in the room when the franchise decided to blow up its 2 best players' partnership. Take a step back and think about how unusual this is for a franchise like Boston. This isn't some rebuilding team quietly shipping out a rotation piece. This is the Celtics, a franchise with 18 championship banners, trading away a player they drafted, developed, and won a title with. And doing it in a way where the head coach wasn't part of the conversation and the owner himself needed to be talked into it. In most organizations, that kind of disconnect between ownership, front office, and coaching staff would be treated as a five-alarm fire. Here, it's being framed as business as usual, just the cost of doing business under a brutal new salary cap system. One Eastern Conference executive, speaking anonymously, summed up the mood around the league perfectly. He said people around the NBA were genuinely caught off guard by how hard and how fast Boston pushed this trade through in a tight window. And now, with the owner going on the radio and essentially saying, "This wasn't me, this was Brad," that executive said the Celtics are, in his words, putting Brad Stevens on the line. And according to that same source, Stevens seems to accept that responsibility. He hasn't run from it. But it's still jarring, as this executive put it, to watch an ownership group publicly separate itself from the basketball decision like this in real time. So why does any of this matter beyond the drama? Because it tells you everything about where accountability sits in Boston right now. If this trade pays off, if Boston wins big, Brad Stevens becomes a genius and nobody remembers this radio interview. But if it doesn't work, if the fit with Paul George is clunky or health becomes an issue, Chisholm has now gone on the record, on Boston radio, essentially saying, "Don't blame me, blame the front office." That's a fascinating and honestly pretty rare thing for an NBA owner to do in public. And look, the results on paper might actually back Stevens up, at least according to the odds makers. Las Vegas currently has Boston's over-under win total at 51.5 games for this season. That's almost identical to the 56 wins Boston posted last year with Brown still on the roster. For context, that number has Boston projected ahead of Brown's new team, the Philadelphia 76ers, who are sitting at 50.5. And Boston is just one game back of the defending champion New York Knicks, who are pegged at 52.5. If Boston hits anywhere near that number and makes a real playoff push, this whole conversation flips, and Stevens gets to say he saw around a corner nobody else could see. But if it goes sideways, we now have it on record, straight from ownership, that this wasn't a unanimous, easy call. It was a fight. Chisholm had to be talked into it. Mazzulla wasn't consulted. And an entire fan base is still processing losing a player they drafted, developed, and watched win a championship with. That's the emotional core of this story, and it's exactly why it's the top headline in Boston sports media this week. Not because the trade itself is new information, we've known about it since July, but because for the first time, the man at the very top of the organization admitted, out loud, on the radio, that he wasn't fully sold. That kind of candor from an NBA owner is rare, and it's going to follow Brad Stevens all season long, especially the first time Boston hits a rough patch. Boston just got named the best landing spot for a six-time All-Star, and it's because of the Jaylen Brown trade. Now here's where things circle right back around. While Celtics fans are still digesting Chisholm's comments, a completely separate report just dropped connecting Boston to one of the more intriguing names still available on the market, DeMar DeRozan. This isn't the first time this has come up either. A couple weeks back, one Bleacher Report analyst already floated Boston as one of the strongest fits for DeRozan. Now, a second Bleacher Report writer has gone even further, ranking the Celtics as DeRozan's single best possible landing spot, ahead of the Miami Heat and the Los Angeles Lakers, who came in second and third on that same list. So why Boston? The reasoning is honestly pretty sharp, and it ties directly back to the hole Jaylen Brown left in this roster. DeRozan has built an entire Hall of Fame caliber career on one specific skill, the self-created mid-range jumper. He's never really been a knockdown three-point shooter, and for most of his career he hasn't been known as a plus defender either. But last season alone, roughly 73% of DeRozan's total shot attempts came from the mid-range, and he made half of them. That is an absurdly high volume for a shot type most modern NBA offenses have basically abandoned. Here's the connection to Brown. Jaylen Brown built a huge chunk of his own scoring identity around that exact same shot. The tough, contested, self-created two. It was actually one of the more polarizing parts of his game among analytics-minded fans, because in theory those shots are inefficient. But in a playoff setting, when defenses lock in and the easy catch-and-shoot threes disappear, having a guy who can just create his own bucket in isolation becomes incredibly valuable. Brown could get those looks. And the numbers back up that DeRozan might be one of the very few free agents on the market who can replicate that specific skill. Only 5 players in the entire league made more mid-range shots than Brown last season, and DeRozan was one of them. He's actually led the league outright in that category in 4 of the last 5 seasons. That's not a small sample. That's a career-defining trait. Now let's talk about who DeRozan actually is at this stage of his career, because context matters here. He's 37 years old. For his career, he's averaging just over 21 points a game on roughly 47% shooting from the field, numbers that put him among the more efficient, high-volume scorers of his generation. Last season, his scoring dipped a bit. He came in at 18.5 points a game on right around 50% shooting, but that's still an incredibly reliable bucket getter, especially off the bench or as a secondary scoring option in a playoff rotation. But, and this is a real but, there are legitimate questions about whether this fit actually makes sense beyond the surface-level shot profile comparison. DeRozan has never been known as a strong defender, and Joe Mazzulla's entire offensive system in Boston is built around spacing the floor and hunting threes. DeRozan doesn't really do that. Fitting a non-shooting, defense-optional veteran next to Jason Tatum, Paul George, and the rest of Boston's rotation isn't necessarily the smoothest roster puzzle to solve. It would honestly be a much more interesting conversation if DeRozan were willing to accept a true sixth-man role coming off the bench, using his shot creation to bail out possessions when the starter's offense stalls. Right now, though, it's genuinely unclear whether a 6-time All-Star at this stage of his career would be willing to sign on for anything less than a significant role. And that's really the crux of the fit question. Boston's offense under Mazzulla lives and dies by ball movement and quick early threes. DeRozan's game, by design, slows possessions down. He wants to isolate, size up his defender, and go get a bucket on his own terms. That's a completely different rhythm than what Boston's current roster is built to run. It doesn't mean the two things can't coexist. Plenty of contenders carry one shot-creating veteran who operates outside the system during crunch time. But it does mean this wouldn't be a plug-and-play addition. It would take real coaching adjustments, and probably some patience from a fan base that's already on edge after the Brown trade. And Boston isn't going to be the only team calling. The Denver Nuggets, fresh off trading away Peyton Watson, reportedly now have their eyes directly on DeRozan as well. League sources have described him as a free agent who remains in serious demand among genuine title contenders, which tells you this isn't a bargain bin value signing. If Boston wants him, they're going to have competition, and possibly a bidding war of sorts for a player who could still contribute real minutes to a contender. Think about the timing of this report too. It's not landing in a vacuum. It's landing in the same week that Boston's own owner is publicly airing his doubts about the trade that created this exact roster need in the first place. Whether that's a coincidence of the news cycle or a sign that people around the league are actively connecting those dots, it's worth watching closely. If Brad Stevens and the front office really do end up circling back to fill this mid-range scoring gap with a free agent addition, it would be a pretty remarkable full-circle moment. Trade away the player who did that job, then spend the following week searching the market for someone who does the exact same job at a lower cost and with far less long-term financial risk attached. So put both of these stories together and you get a pretty clear picture of where the Celtics are right now. Ownership just publicly admitted the Jaylen Brown trade wasn't an easy, unanimous call. Bill Chisholm needed convincing, and Brad Stevens is the one who has to answer for it if it doesn't work out. And at the exact same time, the front office might now be looking at the free agent market to patch the exact hole that trade created, with DeMar DeRozan sitting right there as maybe the closest stylistic replacement available for the shot creation burden Brown used to carry. That's the full story, Celtics fans. An owner who admits he needed convincing, a front office president now fully carrying the weight of the biggest roster decision of the offseason, and a possible DeRozan pursuit that would directly address what Boston lost when Brown left town. Here's the real question for the comment section. Do you trust Brad Stevens after hearing Chisholm's comments this week, or does this admission make you more nervous heading into the season? And separately, would you actually want DeMar DeRozan wearing green, even knowing he doesn't fit the modern three-point heavy system Joe Mazzulla runs? Drop your take below. If you want every Celtics story broken down like this, subscribe to Celtics Daily Hub, hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next update, and we will see you in the very next video.